Was he a brilliant strategist or just a butcher? A national reformer or a man who committed genocide? Some still praise them as heroes, others see only blood on their hands. But winning often means crossing a line others won't dare. Ulysses S. Grant, military genius or relentless butcher? Few generals in American history have seen their reputation shift so drastically. To some, he was a Union's indispensable soldier, the determined commander whose calm persistence broke the Confederacy and preserved the United States. To others, he was a blunt instrument of war, indifferent to casualties and elevated more by northern resources than strategic brilliance. Grant's early military path was largely unremarkable. Born in Ohio in 1822 and educated at West Point, he served capably in the Mexican-American War, but resigned from the army in 1854 amid persistent rumors of drinking. When the Civil War erupted, Grant was working as a clerk in his father's leather goods store. He would join the army as a colonel of volunteers and quickly distinguished himself in the Western theatre. His twin victories at Forts Henry and Donelson in early 1862 gave the Union its first major successes. At Donelson, Grant captured around 12,000 Confederate troops while suffering fewer than 3,000 Union casualties. His demand for unconditional and immediate surrender earned him the nickname Unconditional Surrender Grant. But praise was not universal. That April, Grant's forces suffered over 13,000 casualties at the Battle of Shiloh. Critics labeled him reckless. Some in Washington called for his removal. President Lincoln refused. "I cannot spare this man. He fights." Historians such as Bruce Catton have hailed Vicksburg as among the war's most brilliant campaigns. Grant's coordination, movement and supply management drew admiration from later military analysis. The campaign cost about 10,000 Union casualties but resulted in the capture of 30,000 Confederate troops, a strategic and logistical triumph. Later that year, Grant broke the Confederate siege at Chattanooga, winning another significant victory that demonstrated his effectiveness in both maneuver and morale. These twin successes elevated him to Lincoln's attention as a man who could win the war. In March 1864, Grant was promoted to General-in-Chief of all Union forces. Now based in the East, Grant oversaw a broad strategy to apply simultaneous pressure across all fronts. His Overland Campaign, including the battles of Wilderness, Spotsylvania, and Cold Harbor, was a sustained attempt to engage Robert E. Lee's army directly. In 2 months, Union forces suffered approximately 55,000 casualties. At Cold Harbor alone, a frontal assault resulted in about 7,000 Union casualties in under an hour. Grant later wrote, "I've always regretted that the last assault at Cold Harbor was ever made." Critics seize on such moments. The label of butcher gained traction, particularly among Southerners and early 20th century proponents of the Lost Cause narrative. Douglas Southall Freeman, Lee's biographer, characterized Grant as a technician of war, not a strategist. These portrayals often contrasted Lee's romanticized maneuver warfare with Grant's methodical pressure. Even Northern historians of early 1900s often adopted this view, casting Grant as a competent administrator rather than an inspired general. But modern scholarship has offered a re-evaluation. Historians like Bruce Catton, Brooke Simpson, and John Keegan argue that Grant understood the nature of modern industrial warfare in a way his peers did not. Grant's strategy focused on coordinating multiple offenses, maintaining relentless pressure, and overwhelming Confederate logistics. While costly, this approach yielded results. During the Overland Campaign, Lee's forces lost over 33,000 men, more than 40% of his army, a pace the South could not sustain. Grant also recognized slavery as central to the conflict. He supported the recruitment of black soldiers after 1863, and by war's end, 180,000 black troops had served in the Union Army, a contribution Grant publicly acknowledged as vital. Still, his high casualty rates remain contentious. William McFeely, a critical biographer, argued that Grant's reliance on attrition revealed limited imagination. Others like Gordon Rea and Gary Gallagher contend that Grant's campaign, while bloody, were proportionate to the objectives and consistent with the warfare realities, not wanton waste, and casualty rates were no higher than Lee's. Yet Grant's post-war presidency from 1869 to 1877 was marred by scandals among subordinates and waning Reconstruction momentum. Critics linked his political troubles to earlier military critiques, and the image of a flawed, heavy-drinking soldier president lingered. Only in recent decades have historians begun to reassess his capabilities and contributions. Grant waged modern war before the world fully understood its demands. Whether remembered as a relentless warrior or flawed strategist, his leadership shaped the brutal arithmetic of victory in an industrial age, a legacy still debated more than 150 years later. Douglas Haig remains one of the most divisive figures of the First World War. To supporters, he was a steady commander who endured 4 years of attrition, learned from failure, and led Britain's army to ultimate victory in 1918. To critics, he was a stubborn general responsible for mass slaughter, persisting with outdated tactics while men died in the mud of the Western Front. Even a century later, the debate remains. Was Haig a hero of victory or the butcher of the Somme? Born in Edinburgh in 1861 and educated at Oxford and Sandhurst, Haig entered the army during the height of the Britain's imperial era. He served with distinction in the Sudan and under Kitchener and was mentioned by dispatches for his role in the Second Boer War, gaining a reputation for discipline and professionalism. When war broke out in 1914, he commanded the First Corps of the British Expeditionary Force and quickly emerged as one of its senior officers. In December 1915, he succeeded Sir John French as Commander-in-Chief of the British forces in France and Flanders, a force that would grow from 6 to around 60 divisions by 1918. Haig believed early that large-scale offences were the key to breaking the deadlock on the Western Front. In 1916, he launched a Somme offensive, intended to relieve pressure on the French at Verdun and weaken the German army. On the first day, July 1st, 1916, British forces suffered 60,000 casualties, including 19,000 killed, the worst single day in British military history. Haig pressed on for over 4 months, gaining only limited ground at a cost of more than 400,000 British casualties. Estimates suggest German casualties were also severe, likely between 450 and 500,000. To many, the Somme epitomised futility. Historian Alan Clark portrayed the Somme as a colossal butchery, and David Lloyd George later wrote that Haig was incapable of planning vast campaigns on the scale demanded. The image of incompetence hardened in post-war literature and popular culture. Satirical propaganda such as 1863 musical Oh What Lovely War and the 1989 series Blackadder Goes Forth reinforced the stereotype of a clueless general sending men to die needlessly. Yet defenders argue that Haig faced the brutal realities of industrial war. In 1916, Britain's army was largely inexperienced, battling a well-entrenched enemy with superior defences. Attrition may have been the only strategy available. Historian Gary Sheffield contends, Haig did not choose attrition, attrition chose him. The Somme offensive forced Germany to abandon Verdun, inflicted mass casualties, and showed the Allies could sustain a long campaign. Haig continued to pursue offences in 1917. At Arras, the British made early gains before losing momentum. Later that year at Passchendaele, British and Dominion forces fought in horrendous conditions to capture the ridges east of Ypres. The offensive gained about 5 miles at a cost of roughly 250,000 Allied casualties. Critics again accused Haig of failing to learn. Historian John Keegan called the battle a grim symbol of command stubbornness. However, revisionist scholars argue that the goals to secure strategic ridges and weaken the German army ahead of a major U-boat campaign were sound, even if the timing and logistics faltered. Scholars like Robin Pryor and Trevor Wilson stressed that mud, weather, and poor conditions also shaped the outcome. Haig's reputation rests heavily on these years of stalemate, but the events of 1918 offer a different picture. When Germany launched its spring offensives, Haig held the line, issued the resolute back to the wall order, and supported the integration of Allied command under Ferdinand Foch. By summer, with American troops arriving, the British spearheaded the Hundred Days Offensive, a series of coordinated attacks that pushed the Germans back more than 60 miles and liberated key territory. In these final campaigns, British and Dominion forces achieved what no Allied army had done before, defeating the German army in the field. Historian John Terrain called it the greatest series of victories in British history. Still, debate continues of how much of that success was due to Haig's leadership. Some, like Dennis Winter and Paul Fussell, credit fatigue and American manpower. Others, such as Sheffield and Touraine, argue that Haig's persistence in building a professional modern force was crucial. The question remains whether those hard-won lessons had to come at such staggering cost. After the war, Haig was ennobled as Earl Haig and became a national symbol of victory. He worked tirelessly for veterans, founding the British Legion and advocating for former servicemen. When he died in 1928, thousands lined the streets for his funeral. Yet the rise of memoirs, critical histories, and satirical portrayals in mid-20th century reshaped his legacy. The nickname Butcher Haig took hold. By the 1990s, however, a wave of revisionist historians re-examined his record in the context of early 20th century warfare, arguing that while unimaginative, Haig faced unprecedented challenges few generals could have mastered. Today, Douglas Haig remains a symbol of the terrible transformation of warfare between 1914 and 1918. His armies suffered unimaginable losses, but they ultimately broke the might of the German military machine. Whether he is remembered as a stubborn butcher or an essential architect of victory, his legacy endures. Nguyen Giap stands as one of the 20th century's most consequential military leaders. To admirers, he was a self-taught strategist who defeated both French colonialists and the US military, securing Vietnam's independence and reunification. To critics, he was a commander who accepted staggering human losses in pursuit of political ends. His life reveals the harsh calculus of revolutionary warfare: endurance over maneuver, attrition over speed, and political will over battlefield advantages. Born in 1911, Giap studied law at the University of Hanoi. He joined Ho Chi Minh's Indo-Chinese Communist Party in the 1930s. His personal life was shaped by French colonial repression. His first wife was arrested by colonial authorities and died in prison in 1941. Giap fled to China and began working closely with Ho Chi Minh, eventually becoming military commander of the Viet Minh during World War II. After Japan's defeat in 1945, Vietnam briefly declared independence, but France moved to reassert colonial control. The First Indochina War, 1946 to 1954, followed. Giap waged a drawn-out campaign of ambushes, rural mobilization, and political warfare. With the victory of the Chinese Communist Party in 1949, Giap gained access to critical military aid, including weapons, training, and strategic guidance. His forces were transformed from guerrilla bands into a conventional army. In 1954, Giap orchestrated the decisive battle of Dien Bien Phu. Roughly 50,000 Viet Minh troops surrounded a French base in a remote valley, hauling artillery and supplies through dense jungle and rugged terrain. After a 57-day siege, the French garrison surrendered. Estimates of Viet Minh casualties vary widely. Vietnamese sources cite around 13,000 dead and wounded, while French sources suggest a figure closer to 23,000. Despite the toll, the battle ended French colonial ambitions in Indochina and propelled Giap to international prominence. The Geneva Accords of 1954 divided Vietnam temporarily at the 17th parallel, pending nationwide elections that never occurred. Giap, who has served as defense minister since the late 1940s, remained in that post. In the escalating conflict with the United States and South Vietnam, he advocated a strategy of protracted war. The aim was not to win quickly through decisive battles, but to wear down a technologically superior opponent through time, political resilience, and steady attrition. Between 1965 and 1975, the Vietnam War exacted a devastating human cost. Credible estimates suggest that between 2.5 and 3.5 million Vietnamese were killed, including up to 2 million civilians. Both sides employed brutal methods. US bombing campaigns, search and destroy missions, and chemical attacks such as Agent Orange inflicted widespread suffering. Giap's forces often operated within civilian populations, a tactic that blurred the lines between combatant and non-combatant and contributed to the war's destructiveness. In 1967, as North Vietnam's leadership debated launching a broad offensive, Giap reportedly warned against it, cautioning that the population was exhausted and the timing unwise. The 1968 Tet Offensive, largely driven by Party General Secretary and other hardliners, struck over 100 cities and towns across South Vietnam, including Saigon and Hue. Although the offensive failed militarily, US and South Vietnamese forces quickly repelled the attacks, and communist troops' losses may have reached 50,000. It had a profound psychological impact in the United States, eroding public support and prompting a strategic reassessment in Washington. The most notorious episode of the Tet Offensive was the Hue Massacre. During their 3-week occupation of the city, Communist forces executed thousands of South Vietnamese officials, perceived collaborators, and civilians. Estimates range from 2,800 to over 6,000 victims. While there's no evidence that Giap personally ordered or even approved these killings, they were carried out by units operating on the military structure he helped create. Historians continue to debate the extent to which the massacre was premeditated versus improvised amid the fog of war. Following the Tet Offensive, Giap's influence within the Politburo declined. Operational command gradually shifted to younger leaders. Nevertheless, Giap remained Minister of Defense during major campaigns, including the 1972 Easter Offensive, which failed to achieve its objectives but gained territory and paved the way for the final phase of the war. In 1975, North Vietnamese forces launched a rapid conventional assault that culminated in the fall of Saigon in April. The war was over. Victory had come at a monumental cost. Giap's long war doctrine had succeeded, but at the expense of millions of lives and widespread devastation. Historian Christopher Gosha observes that Giap approached war with a cold calculus, treating manpower as a renewable resource. Others, such as Peter MacDonald, argued that Giap had no alternative given Vietnam's economic and technological inferiority. His strategic model, in which time, not firepower, was a decisive factor, remains a subject of both admiration and criticism. Giap died in 2013 at the age of 102. In Vietnam, he is remembered as a national hero. Internationally, assessments are more divided. He demonstrated how political will, mass mobilization, and strategic patience could overcome vastly superior military forces. But his victories were also victories of attrition, hard-fought, costly, and morally complex. Whether seen as a visionary patriot or a ruthless practitioner of total war, Giap remains one of the most defining military figures of the modern era. The figure of Oliver Cromwell looms large in 17th century history. To his admirers, he was the iron-willed commander who crushed tyranny, built one of the most disciplined armies of his era, and defended the liberties of Parliament against absolutism. To his detractors, he was a regicidal usurper, a sanctimonious Puritan whose campaigns in Ireland amounted to genocide, and who in the end became the very thing he claimed to oppose, a military dictator. When civil war broke out in 1642, he was already in his 40s and had no great office. Yet once on the battlefield, he revealed a rare gift for leadership. He drilled his Ironsides cavalry in fierce discipline, the morale reinforced by fervent Puritan zeal. At Marston Moor in 1644, they smashed the Royalist cavalry, and at Naseby, the following year, Cromwell, now Lieutenant General of Horse in a new model army, helped secure Parliament's decisive victory. The civil wars made Cromwell, but they also began to expose the contradictions that would haunt his legacy. To many contemporaries, he was a champion of liberty, the man who broke the king's sword and humbled the aristocracy. Historian Christopher Hill later called him the embodiment of an English revolution, sweeping away feudal remnants and opening the path to modern capitalism. Cromwell's army was meritocratic, advancing men for talent rather than noble blood, and in this sense, revolutionary. Yet the others, even among his allies, he was already showing a taste for power and a conviction that he alone knew God's will. That conviction carried him into darker territory. In January 1649, Charles I was tried and executed for treason, the first king in Europe to be legally put to death by his subjects. Cromwell signed the death warrant. For a royalist, this branded him forever as regicide. For later Republicans, it made him a forerunner of liberty. But for Ireland, Cromwell's name carries a different and darker meaning. Dispatched by the new Commonwealth to crush resistance, Cromwell landed in Dublin in August 1649 with 12,000 seasoned troops. His campaign was swift and devastating. At Drogheda in September, after a week-long siege, Cromwell's army stormed the town. The defenders, about 2,500 to 3,000 strong, were largely English royalists and Irish allies. Once inside, Cromwell ordered no quarter. His own dispatch coolly recorded, "In the heat of the action, I forbade them to spare any that were in arms in the town, and I think that night they put to the sword about 2,000 men." Even priests and friars were executed. People sheltering in St. Peter's Church, primarily defenders with some non-combatants, perished when it was set on fire. A month later, the pattern repeated at Wexford. If Drogheda was calculated terror, Wexford was anarchic destruction. Troops running amok, while flags of truce fluttered uselessly. Negotiations were underway when Cromwell's troops forced entry. What followed was chaos. Around 3,500 people were killed, roughly 2,000 royalist soldiers and 1,500 civilians. These massacres seared themselves into Irish memory. Mícheál Ó Siochrú has argued that Cromwell's actions fit the definition of genocide in their aim to terrorise Catholic Ireland into submission. Others like John Morrell stressed that the killings, though appalling, were not entirely outside the brutal norms of 17th century siege warfare. Garrisons that refused to surrender often faced annihilation. Yet even within that context, Drogheda and Wexford stand out for their scale and their deliberate terror. Cromwell's forces pushed through the country, devastating crops, burning homes and seizing livestock in a scorched earth policy designed to starve resistance. Disease and famine soon completed Ireland's ruin. By 1652, the combined total of war, famine and plague had wiped out perhaps a fifth of the population. Contemporary surveyor William Petty estimated over 600,000 deaths, about 40% of the population, though modern historians put that figure closer to 20%. In addition, some 10 to 20,000 Irish people, including prisoners of war, were sold as indentured labourers under the British Commonwealth, transported to colonies in North America and the Caribbean. For many historians, Cromwell's conquest was not merely a military victory, it was a violent reordering of an entire nation. In the years after the conquest, massive land confiscations reshaped Ireland. Catholic ownership fell from around 60% before the wars to barely 10% by the 1650s. Back in England, Cromwell's reputation took a different turn. He was celebrated as the man who destroyed the monarchy and preserved Parliament. Yet he quickly showed that his loyalty to liberty had limits. Frustrated with political quarrels, in 1653 he marched soldiers into the House of Commons and dissolved it. After dissolving the rump in 1653, Cromwell accepted the title of Lord Protector, Head of State for Life, Commander of the Army, and Chief of the Council of State. Though styled as a protectorate, it functioned much like a constitutional monarchy without a king, his power resting ultimately on the loyalty of the army. To supporters, this was a reluctant duty thrust upon him. To critics, it was naked dictatorship. Blair Warden has noted that Cromwell's genuine commitment to liberty was continually undermined by his inability to trust others to safeguard it. When he died in 1658, the experiment collapsed almost at once, his republic unable to survive without the force of his will. Within 2 years, the monarchy was restored. In a final act of vengeance, his body was exhumed, hanged and beheaded, his head displayed on a spike above Westminster Hall. Yet his ghost was not so easily banished. In the centuries since, Cromwell has been endlessly reinterpreted. To Victorians, he was recast as a defender of English liberty. To Irish nationalists, a symbol of cruelty. Even today, he divides opinion. Mustafa Kemal Atatürk remains one of the most debated figures in modern history. To many Turks, he's the saviour of the nation, the soldier who repelled foreign invaders and built a republic from the ruins of an empire. To others, he was an authoritarian modernizer who imposed radical change by decree, silencing dissent in the name of progress. Nearly a century after his death, Atatürk's legacy still shapes Turkey's national identity. Born in 1881 in Salonika, then part of the Ottoman Empire, Mustafa Kemal rose through the Ottoman military ranks by merit. He served in the Balkan Wars and during World War I became a national hero at Gallipoli. In 1915, his leadership helped halt the Allied invasion of the Dardanelles at enormous cost. His famous command to his troops, "I do not order you to attack, I order you to die," cemented his legend. After the Ottoman defeat in 1918, Allied powers occupied the empire and the Treaty of Sèvres proposed to partition its remains. Refusing to accept dismemberment, Mustafa Kemal organised national resistance from Anatolia, opposing both occupying forces and the compliant Ottoman government in Istanbul. Between 1919 and 1922, his forces won the Turkish War of Independence, defeating Greek, Armenian and French armies. The Treaty of Lausanne in 1923 replaced Sèvres, secured Turkey's borders and legitimised the new state. That same year, the Republic of Turkey was proclaimed, with Mustafa Kemal as its first president. He would adopt the surname Atatürk in 1934, meaning father of the Turks. One consequence of the Lausanne Treaty was a massive compulsory population exchange between Greece and Turkey. Over 1 million Anatolian Greeks and hundreds of thousands of Muslims were uprooted to forge new, homogeneous nation-states. Atatürk's leadership had preserved Turkey's sovereignty, but at great human cost. Ataturk then turned to sweeping transformation of Turkish society. The Caliphate was abolished in 1924, religious courts and schools were closed, and Islamic law replaced with a secular legal code modelled on Europe's. In 1928, Arabic script was replaced with a Latin-based alphabet. The fez, associated with Ottoman tradition, was banned in favour of Western-style hats. Women gained full suffrage in 1934, earlier than many European nations, and the 1926 Civil Code outlawed polygamy and guaranteed women's civil marriage rights. Free, compulsory primary education and expanded state-run schools helped lift literacy from single digits to over 30% in a decade. To admirers, these reforms were a social revolution. Historian Bernard Lewis called him a dictator, but a dictator in the cause of liberty. Many argue that authoritarian means were necessary in a country emerging from war and collapse. Ataturk's model of state-led, secular modernization influenced many post-colonial nations. Yet critics view this record as coercive. Religion, once central to public life, was restricted to the private sphere. The 1925 Sheikh Zayed rebellion, led by Kurdish separatists and Islamic conservatives, was crushed with mass arrests and executions. The 1937-38 Dersham rebellion met even harder repression, leaving thousands dead. Kurdish identity was denied under a state ideology that declared citizens Turks. Political opposition was stifled. Early experiments with opposition parties in 1924 and 1930 were swiftly shut down when they gained traction. Historian Eric Zurcher notes that the Kemalist state rested on the denial of pluralism, ethnic, religious, and political. Ataturk's foreign policy was defined by caution and pragmatism. His slogan, "Peace at home, peace in the world," reflected a commitment to stability after years of war. He pursued diplomatic normalization with Greece and the Soviet Union while investing in industrial development and economic self-sufficiency at home. By the time of his death in 1938, Turkey was a secular republic with recognized borders, centralized authority, and a growing state apparatus. Ataturk's image soon dominated public life. Statues in every town, his face on currency, his portrait in every government office. Insulting his memory remains a criminal offence to this day. Modern historians remain divided. Scholars like Andrew Mango and Bernard Lewis stress his success in building a modern nation state from imperial ruins. Others, such as Eric Zurcher and Faraz Ahmad, emphasize the cost, suppression of democracy, cultural hegemony, and centralized control. Mustafa Kemal transformed Turkey through forceful reform. He ended foreign occupation and dismantled Ottoman institutions and established a new state. But he did so through centralized power, intolerance of pluralism and dissent.